Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler. The last few episodes we've been looking at some things that are in my Star Wars Home Video Library, much of which came into my collection through Matt Fry when he donated his collection into mine. They're just things I hadn't covered before because they were, in those episodes, parodies that I hadn't really taken the time to delve too much into because I've been mainly looking at original, official Star Wars releases from the US and elsewhere. But now that official releases are kind of dwindling, we're focusing on some of the more oddball stuff that is in my collection, as we have before sporadically. This time kind of in a nice little stretch here. What we're looking at this time is another of those types of items, but not a parody in this case. In this case, it is a Star Wars documentary made by fans about fans, essentially, or at least made about fans, that is focused on a different market than I usually see the focus on when it comes to a lot of documentaries about fans. Usually if it's a documentary about fans, it's about fans in the US, maybe in the UK. In this case, it's about fans in Australia. And it's one of the more positive takes on Star Wars fandom that I have seen as a documentary series. But it's definitely much less a broad coverage of Star Wars fans and more about a specific group, which is not necessarily clear in the text when you're actually looking at the packaging and deciding whether to pick up this DVD. It is a documentary that was released in 2002 entitled, and this is kind of a poor title to use looking at things today, The PhanDom Menace. Now that is fandom with a PH, not an F. These days, the so-called PhanDom Menace with an F, which would share its name with the Star Warped parody we saw a little while ago in a previous episode, is sort of this anti-Disney, anti-SJW, anti-woke, anti-all that stuff segment within fandom that is very vociferous, very boisterous, very, what's the word I'm looking for, very visible online, that takes sort of a hard anti-Disney stance on really any modern Star Wars stuff. Eventually the name came to stick, PhanDom Menace, as a parody, which is unfortunate because there are plenty of other things that have been called PhanDom Menace before that now sort of get painted with that same brush because of that shared name. This being one of them, this is not that. This is a documentary released on home video back in 2002 that focuses on Australian Star Wars fans. They are members of the Star Wars Appreciation Society of Australia. This was founded in 1988 and includes a lot of interviews with members of what's referred to as the Star Walking Committee. It does have some celebrity interviews, like Hugh Corshi, who played Panaka, is in it, for example. There's some store owners at conventions talking about the merchandising of Phantom Menace and whatnot, but mostly it is looking at the fans themselves. There is no narration to this at all. It is essentially just live footage, recorded, edited together to create this somewhat narrative that we'll get into of exactly how they lay it out here. But it's a fairly positive documentary about Star Wars fans focused on this specific Australian fan group. So up here, also with PHs, it says, The Fans, The Force, The Fear, The PhanDom Menace. A Primordial / Clint Flicks production. On the spine, it's just the title, a star, DVD video, product number, and then this says Eclectic DVD Distribution. This is actually made, printed in Canada, so this is a version that will play in the US. On the back, you've got the website, thephandommenace.com with PH, The PhanDom Menace. Craig E. Tonkin and Warwick Holt present the definitive look at the most devoted fans on the planet. Information we'll read here. Information about bonus features made in Canada. DVD Region 0, 62 minutes, Dolby Digital Stereo DVD. Eclectic DVD Distribution here again with their information, legalese and whatnot, and the 2002 copyright with the UPC. Images, of course, from it. What it says here is, follow the lives of Australia's most passionate Star Wars fans as the moment they've waited 16 years for is suddenly upon them. That is the premiere of Phantom Menace after Return of the Jedi, if you didn't figure out what the 16 years was. See the amazing costumes, trivia-soaked brains, vast collections, and unconditional dedication that make these fans a breed apart. Be stunned by the shockwaves that echo through the Star Wars fan community at the dawn of its new prequel era. Then it notes the extra features there, which include a director's commentary, a cast commentary, extended interviews, which are actually in the outtakes section, along with a couple of actual outtakes. The extended interviews are the final interview with Shane Moriarty, who was actually the head of that group until after the Phantom Menace, where he referred to Phantom Menace as being a lot of CG made for 12-year-olds and had no soul, unlike the previous film, which is when he kind of took the step, you know what, it's time for me to step down from this and retire. He sold off his collection, or the bulk of his collection. Kind of feels like when I stepped away from the Star Wars Timeline Gold and I had sold off my book collection to make my book and comic collection mostly to make room for the Star Wars home video stuff, so that did kind of resonate with me here. And interestingly, one thing I really think is really cool about this, that I would love for more films to do, but I know why from a right standpoint they don't, the complete soundtrack is in the bonus features. Yes, you go to bonus features, there are 12 individual listings under the soundtrack for the songs used in this, and you can just click and listen to the whole thing for each song. Really, really cool to include that as a bonus feature. Granted, you can't play it on a music player, it's got to be played on your DVD player, but still, I thought that was a really cool bonus feature to have. So, flush with some bonus features here, a documentary that runs about an hour about that committee, as it's called, again, it's the Star Walking Committee, which I guess is the people who run the Star Wars Appreciation Society of Australia. But because of that, I keep saying committee. That's who it's kind of focused on, even though the group itself is sort of the broader focus. So yeah, the PhanDom Menace with a star behind it, images from it, DVD video, eclectic films distribution, and then a product number there at the bottom. Okay. What's interesting about this is, again, since there is no narrator, there's a question sort of how do they form the narrative of this? And I've got my crappy handwritten notes here. So they start talking about collecting, and then eventually move into the premiere of Phantom Menace, which they got a big sort of like first showing, everyone gathered together from the club type of thing to see it. And so the reactions that came from it as well. Then we do have a shift then to look at conventions, where they also have some interviews with people like Michael Stackpole, Timothy Zahn, which is interesting. I found it interesting that the way that Timothy Zahn talked about Heir to the Empire in this is that it's not that he was sort of relaunching or bringing Star Wars back per se, but that he was just creating a story with Star Wars to help prove the viability of more Star Wars, which I thought was kind of an interesting take on that. It does dive into fan films a bit, and because of when this was made, I mentioned in the previous episode, I think on Star Warped, that I spent some time within the Star Wars fan film community for a while before becoming more kind of like one of the early people in the Star Wars fan audio community. And it was interesting because as they're talking about fan films, because of when this was being made, a lot of the names that popped up, I was like, I know of this person, I know of this person. I watched that film, because I haven't watched fan films in ages. But these were all ones that stuck out to me, like Justin Dix with Bounty Trail, or Desert Duel, or Sacrifices, a lot of these early fan films, and kind of the love and thought process that went into them. The idea that make it abstract, because if you make it close to real, people expect realism, so make it abstract, as was the case with Sacrifices. Kind of cool to see that. Then it moves on into the changing of the guard, the changing of leadership and whatnot for the group, as I mentioned with the one individual, Shane Moriarty, who has stepped away after Phantom Menace and then sold off a lot of stuff, handing it over to Chris Brennan, who was also the head of the Star Wars Collectors Guild at one point, if not at the same time simultaneously. I'm not 100% sure. So it's an interesting take, but it's all very positive. It's all like, this is what we do, this is what we thought of this is what we thought of that, this is where we find the joy in this kind of collecting, this is a way of approaching this type of collecting. It's one of these documentaries that's not trying to tell the story of Star Wars fans from an outside perspective, because from the outside perspective, we've seen it can be fairly positive or it can be very negative in the way that it presents people and talks about those people. Particularly, I'm thinking of A Galaxy Far, Far Away, for example. It's sitting up there on my shelf. This one, in making it essentially completely their own words, their own discussions, their own lives, their interviews with the people in the group, rather than taking that outside perspective, it's more like, how do I understand this from within, and the phenomena of what is giving these people joy and why they stick around with this. It comes off as one of the more positive-oriented Star Wars documentaries that I have ever seen about fans rather than about the franchise itself. That said, there's not a whole lot otherwise to it. I mean, it's not like there are a lot of flashy, oh, this is so awesome type moments in it. It's just one of those, it's a very positive take. It's a cool DVD release. It's got some solid bonus features to go with it. The end, essentially, when it comes to this. But unique in that it is focused on that Australian set of fans, which presents a different approach to the market. They even call out the differences between some of those conventions, like when Stackpole and Zahn are at, I think it's Force 3, the difference between the conventions at the time in Australia versus in, say, the United States, and how more intimate it tended to be. I kind of compare it to the way that, for me, in the early 2000s, I much preferred Con Carolinas in Charlotte rather than Dragon Con in Atlanta, even though I live in the Atlanta area, because it was a smaller thing. You had a chance to meet creators more and have more interactions rather than being this big overblown type thing. So a lot that I can empathize with, not emphasize, but empathize, sympathize, whatever, relate to with this, even though, of course, I'm in the U.S. and this was primarily set in Australia. But yeah, an interesting one. Definitely not one that's going to blow the roof off of anything when it comes to Star Wars documentaries, but also one that is not going to be demeaning to the people who are watching it, like some of the other ones that we have seen. So if you're looking for a breath of fresh air after watching some of those more demeaning ones, this is one to check out. Again, with an unfortunate name in today's context, but at least it's a PH, not an F, the PhanDom Menace. On DVD from 2002. Now, part of my Star Wars home video library, thanks to Matt Fry. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force, maybe spelled with a PH, be with the home video viewers.